So a few months have now passed since the United States decided to put new taxes on imported goods, new taxes on U.S. businesses importing goods from certain companies. Those are called tariffs, by the way. Those are taxes. And there were a lot of alarming headlines around that about empty shelves or iPhones that would cost $2,000. However, fast forward to today, and a lot of that hasn't really happened, or at least not in a way that consumers, people buying consumer tech like you and me, would notice. And then, of course, that begs the question, well, what happened? What's going on? I actually reported on tariffs a bit myself recently. I wrote this article here for IEEE Spectrum about how the tariffs could impact engineering and make it more expensive to learn. There was a lot of talk from Adafruit about and that is a retailer that specializes in consumer electronics for hobbyists and engineers, things like Raspberry Pis, breadboards. You can buy 50 LEDs for whatever you need them for. And the More Freed has been a pretty big critic of the tariffs and has said that the company was getting hit with tens of thousands of dollars of tariffs. I also spoke with Eben Upton and Nirav Patel. That's Eben Upton of Raspberry Pi and Nirav Patel of Framework. And they all had very different perspectives. So if you want sort of a comprehensive look at tariffs from different perspectives in the consumer electronics industry, I'll link to the article in the description of this video. But the basics were that, there was a lot of chaos and a lot of concern about what was going to happen, with Freed saying that prices on some things could triple. But I also, around the time that the tariffs started to be put into place, decided to track them for myself. I created a basket of goods. I called it the Work From Here basket of goods. I have a newsletter I occasionally update called Work From Here about working from home and consumer tech in that angle. And if we go and take a look at that, here is our basket of goods. And this is the latest update as of today, June 19th. And the way this works is that I'm simply keeping track of prices as they fluctuate. And I will move it over here so you can see all of it. The green are prices that went down. The red are prices that went up. And as you can see, they're more or less equivalent. Some prices have indeed gone up and some have gone down. And the theorized $2,000 iPhone definitely has not occurred. So now we have to ask why? Why haven't the prices really changed that much, despite the fact that we are, almost 3 months into this now? And despite the fact that companies have, in fact, paid tariffs. In some cases, they have paid tariffs of over 100% on certain items. That has happened. Of course, they fluctuate all the time. They probably fluctuated from in the hour it'll take me to record this video and then upload it. But, some of those tariffs are getting paid. And that leaves us with a bit of a mystery from the consumer tech perspective. In fact, just recently, Gamers Nexus put up another video talking with the PC hardware component suppliers, and they again reiterated some of the price changes they have had to make. And indeed, there have been some price changes on some items. But in general, if you're buying a computer today or building a computer today, it's hard to say that there's been any substantial increase in the price compared to what it was 3 months ago. Maybe the price has gone up on certain things, but if you decide to buy other items than those that have gone up in price, you can land in a very similar place to where you were before. And I think this comes down to a few main reasons. The first is that a lot of companies have been hoarding and importing at specific times when tariffs have been at their lowest in order to have the least impact on their business. When the tariffs first went into effect, there were some humorous headlines about Apple sending over planes loaded with iPhones to try and get as many iPhones in before the tariffs took effect. I don't know how true that really was. if that was really that much different than how Apple normally did things. But in general, there was actually an uptick in shipping just before the tariffs hit. In fact, from the time that Donald Trump was elected president again to the tariffs coming into effect, a lot of companies expected there would be tariffs, so they were already shipping in more stuff than they would have before. And, I guess that proved to be a pretty good bet. There also seems like there's probably going to be an uptick in stuff happening right now because we have this pause on the tariffs. Maybe it's really a pause. Maybe it's a new policy. There's new deals being made. But companies are taking advantage of any time the tariffs seem to be lower to ship in as much goods as possible. And the bigger the company, I think, the more they can do that. And obviously, a company like Apple can afford to suddenly order and ship in a whole bunch more stuff and really accelerate their production, more so than could a company like Framework, for example, which is much more at the mercy of general trends in consumer electronics. Another thing is that a lot of companies are, in fact, absorbing prices. How much so depends on the company, but if you look at the most recent discussion from retailers and from some companies that make consumer electronics, they do have in their quarterly reports some indications that they are lowering margins in order to absorb some of the cost. I think companies are generally just a little afraid to raise prices because, of course, that could be a disadvantage if someone else doesn't do that. If Dell raises the prices, but Asus does not, then you're probably more likely to buy an Asus laptop than you would a Dell, right? Now, eventually, you would think the pain will get too great, and maybe that'll happen. But it's worth pointing out that despite a lot of doom and gloom about the economy in general, in the United States, the economy has objectively, factually, overall, been doing very, very well. And companies in particular have had extremely high profits. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there for them to just kind of eat that and still do just fine. But of course, the question is, will that change? As I said, will there become a point where the pain is too much, the margins are too slim, and the companies have to start increasing their prices? Dell just says, we got to pass this on. And I think the answer is, it depends. We'll have to keep a very close eye on what the upcoming holiday shopping season looks like. It seems at this point that with the tariff deals and various exceptions being made, that there's probably going to be a pretty good amount of shipments coming in at reasonable prices for the holiday season. So possibly any major price increases that you might have expected to see in the worst case scenario of the 145% tariff on China is not going to happen. And maybe the holiday season will come through pretty unscathed. My current bias is certainly to expect that there won't be any big price increases looking through the end of the year. And that is probably going to continue into next year, regardless of really how tariffs change from this very point on, because there's already a lot of shipments coming in, and companies and retailers plan this out very far in advance, because it does, as you might imagine, take a little bit of time to get a shipment across the ocean from China or Vietnam or wherever to America, and to load it up on their end, to unpack on our end, to put it on a train, to send it to, Oklahoma or wherever in the middle of the country that you need to send it to. Takes quite some time. So, that's what those gigantic warehouses in places like the Inland Empire in California are for. They're for holding all that incredible amount of stuff that we order and then hold. At this point, I have no real reason to expect that we're going to see stocks dwindle very quickly. So it's probably going to be next year before any major pain really hits consumers. With that said, unfortunately, I do think this is something that's probably going to hit smaller companies more than bigger companies. And so companies like Adafruit and Framework, for example, are in relatively vulnerable positions here, which is a real shame because personally, I would like to see those companies do well and provide more competition overall in consumer electronics, right? They also serve very interesting niches in the market. But the fact of the matter is that if we're in this environment where things are unstable and you have an advantage as a consumer electronics company to be able to order a bunch of product and potentially hold on to that while you sell it through and weather any bumps in the tariff environment. Of course, that's going to give an advantage to companies that have a lot of money. Apple has a lot of money. Dell, relative to other companies, has a lot of money. So companies like that, they can order a bunch of product and hold on to it with less risk. But the smaller companies simply don't have the capital to go and spend, perhaps millions of dollars on a bunch of stock that they're going to hold for the coming months. Apple in particular is an interesting case because they have a relatively slim number of products and they are very rigorous about their product schedules. So I'm sure that compared to other companies, they have relatively good idea of what their upcoming product lineup is going to be, what exactly is going to be in it, and how much they want to sell that for and how many they plan to sell. They might be a little wrong, but you can see how Apple's situation is different from, say, Framework, which is has launched a new 12-inch Framework laptop that is repairable. But, the question is like, how many of those do you bring in? What's the tariff situation going to be? How well is that going to sell? Framework, I'm sure, has estimates, but compared to what Apple can put out, I'm sure those estimates are a lot less reliable. And there's a lot more risk for the company putting out a new product like that. But let's just end this on a bit of actionable advice for you. Maybe you are thinking about buying something this holiday season and you're curious what you should do. Should you go ahead and shop earlier to avoid any potential impact of tariffs, or should you wait? I would say that at this point, my prevailing advice for buying consumer electronics is going to hold, which is simply to buy what you need when you need it. Seems sensible enough, I'm sure, but the fact of the matter is it's actually quite easy to get yourself into a panic buying situation. A great example of this, I think, is, I saw back when Donald Trump was reelected, there was a bit of a panic buy of some GPUs. Because the assumption was that there would be tariffs and various restrictions on GPUs, and this would be bad for GPU pricing. And certainly, GPUs are not cheap. But they weren't cheap before. And at that time, NVIDIA's new RTX 50 series wasn't out. So if you bought RTX 4080, let's say, back in late November, early December, did you get a deal compared to buying an RTX 5080 today? I would say probably not. I would say that you're no better than neutral. And of course, you could have waited to see what the pricing was going to be on that new GPU before you made a decision. Now, most consumer electronics are not going to be quite as high drama as buying a GPU, but in any case, it's really hard at this point to predict when any price increase is going to hit the consumer electronics market. And it's not certain that a appreciable price increase will hit most consumer electronics overall. I think the only areas where there's a pretty good chance you're going to see significant price increases are unfortunately those areas where you have a lot of individual components that are being brought in. Things like a power supply for a computer or things like an LCD for a hobbyist project. A lot of that stuff just has no option to be made in the United States. And in addition to that, the companies that are selling those products actually are making them, or at least they're under their brand. And then the retailers that sell them have relatively little say in how and when those products are manufactured and where those products are manufactured. So they're in a tough spot, and they may face situations where they don't have any way to avoid. They also have relatively low margins usually, so it's very hard for them to avoid price increases. It's probably bad news for hobbyists, which is why I wrote the article for IEEE Spectrum about how we may see price increases for learning to get into engineering, doing hobbyist engineering products on your own. The outlook there is the worst of any sort of outlook, and that's where I would expect to see price increases come through first. If you want to buy a laptop, though, just cool your jets. Wait and see what happens. I think that the holiday 2025 shopping season will be very instructive for how tariffs might come through the entire consumer electronics market. And we'll reconvene then and see what has been going on. Do keep your eye out in particular for what happens with Apple's upcoming iPhones and MacBooks. That will be, I think, a big indicator, because, of course, Apple was not able to stock any of those products before any of the new tariffs had come about. And Apple, in general, tries to be very competitive in pricing, but they also want to have very high margins for the products. So they're probably going to be very reluctant, if the margin is significantly impacted by tariffs, to just eat that, despite the fact they could. So when we get the new iPhones and new MacBooks announced, and iPads later this year, if we start to see price increases, or we start to see that prices are kind of the same, but you're not really getting a whole lot more for your money, that's going to be telling. Anyway, thanks for watching. That's all I got on this topic for now. I'll see you next time.